We're going to go ahead and start taking questions from the audience at this point. And I'll begin with our first question. Can you describe how USGS is working with federal land management agencies to inventory areas of known or suspected occurrences of critical minerals so that this information can be used to protect access to such potential mineral deposits?
So the USGS works with a variety of federal partners to meet their land management needs. The USGS itself has no regulatory function. We just apply the basic science for them. We have an ongoing project with the Bureau of Land Management to help them with their statutorily required need to do an assessment for the lands they are proposing to withdraw relative to sage grouse management. And so we are doing an assessment of roughly the 10 million acres that they're proposing for withdrawal, looking at the abundance, presence, and quality of mineral resources on those lands, using a modified version of the assessment protocol that BLM normally uses for their evaluation. And our scientists are using the best available published information to pull all that together, including geochemistry and geophysics, to make the best possible assessment of the potential of those lands.
Thank you so much, Larry. The second question is, what does the price of critical minerals really reflect? It seems more artificial than base precious metals that follow supply-demand pricing. And maybe this would be a good question for Rod.
Well, fundamentally, a price for any raw material represents some sort of balance between supply and demand. It's a market price. Now, clearly, there are different types of markets. Some markets are deeper, have more frequent transactions, and for those materials, a price, I think, any particular price that we observe comes closer to reflecting what you might call the fundamental underlying features of supply and demand. For markets, which is true for many of the what people identify as critical minerals, these are smaller markets, fewer transactions, actions are more opaque, and as a result, not just the availability, but the pricing is more fragile, and it's more difficult to, first of all, know what the price is, and even if you see a price reported in the trade press, it's difficult to know exactly what underlies that price. I wouldn't call that an artificial price, but these are markets, small markets, small number of transactions, where interpreting the price is more difficult, understanding what might be the correct price is more difficult, and that's one aspect of criticality.
Thank you so much, Rod. The next question is, critical or strategic minerals are supplied through more of a diamond than a pyramid. Who's researching or monitoring the middle of the diamond, processing traders and subcomponent manufacturers?
Perhaps I can address that. It's a kind of mineral information question. I think there are various sources of information about trade flows between the information that we collect and on mining and first stage mineral processing and use. And in some cases, those data are very good. And there are a number of sources that you can access for this kind of information, the UN Comtrade database and others. What we encounter as an issue in this aspect of what we do is that for materials that are not as common and aren't as large a market as Rod Eggert was just referring to, that we don't always have good visibility on flows, particularly for countries where reporting is not complete or in some cases even available. And in many cases, we don't get the kind of granularity we need in the trade data, in the sense that oftentimes materials are combined into categories that doesn't really allow you to deconvolute the information to the level you would like to. So for example, tantalum and niobium are often reported together in a single category, so you can't really tell how much of each is in a particular trade flow. There are those kinds of issues that you encounter when looking at trade data. The other thing about the middle of the diamond, if you will, to use your analogy, is that we feel on the mining and mineral processing end that we have pretty good visibility, comprehensive data. There are data for trade flows, but it is in fact the case that as you move further down the supply chain to intermediate compounds and precursor compounds for making specific kinds of components, that the data are much less available, much less comprehensive, much less quantitative. This is something that a number of our agency partners struggle with, and that we believe has to be fundamentally improved.
This is Rod Eggert. I might jump in as well. Indicate that the research activities of the Critical Materials Institute, I think, primarily focus on the middle of the diamond, in that we are not involved in geoscience research, but to use the example of rare earths, we are carrying out research that focuses on what you do with the raw ore. So we have research activities related to beneficiation, separations, separating one individual rare earth from another, and then once you get the oxides, reducing them to metal.
Thank you. The next question is, how can the state geological surveys best support the USGS national efforts and programs focused on minerals?
I can start with that. Larry may want to weigh in as well. We have a memorandum of understanding with virtually all of the state geological surveys, and rely on them for information from producers and activity in mineral mining and processing at the state level. And it is essential that cooperation continue and be strengthened. I think it is a mutually beneficial function that we perform, and that the state surveys and other government organizations perform, that in place for many years and needs to continue, and we need to look for ways to add additional value to the information that we feed back to our state cooperators from the information that they give to us.
And on the research side of the equation, we also work closely with the state geologists, particularly to try to leverage the work that they're doing at the state level with what we contribute at the federal level. As examples of this, we do a variety of geophysical and remote sensing surveys, and we try to coordinate those with ongoing mapping at the state level by state geologists. We have one such project going on in Alaska, another one in New York State, another one in Iowa and Missouri, and all of these are very carefully coordinated with the state geologists, and their support of our work and our support of their work is an excellent example of state-federal cooperation.
That was a great question. Thank you. The next question is, we have seen the price of rare earth elements, particularly light rare earths, decreased substantially over the last year. Could you address some of the reasons for this decrease?
I can answer that question, or at least provide an answer to that question. This is Rod Eggert. And it's I would say largely due to significant production in China. The Chinese national government has established production quotas of something like 105,000 tons, and yet the actual production is something like 130 or 140,000 tons. So there's a lot of unsanctioned production some of which was motivated by the higher prices of 2010, 2011, that in effect have swung the market from one that was perceived as significant scarcity to one of overabundance and oversupply. A second part of the answer is that some of the price spike associated with rare earths, I think in retrospect, can be explained through either speculative activities or panic buying on the part of customers, customers of rare earths that were witnessing price rises, who would normally inventory maybe 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 months of rare earth materials, where it was reported accumulating stockpiles of 2 to 3 years as opposed to 2 to 3 months of rare earth materials, which drove prices even higher. And at some point, consumers started using stockpiled material rather than making new purchases, which contributed significantly to the dramatic fall in rare earth prices.
Thank you, Rod. Next question, what is the potential for undiscovered critical minerals in the U.S.?
This is Larry. I can probably answer that one the best. We do a variety of assessments of undiscovered minerals, and as you might guess, this is not a straightforward matter. It starts with using basic geologic data, such as geologic maps, geophysics, geochemistry, and what you are doing is identifying blocks of ground that have the potential for having the same types of deposits that we know from discovered deposits. And you work your way systematically through these data sets to cover whatever area of interest, whether that be a state, a country, or the entire globe. And there's a fairly complex process that's been laid out for how to do this, and it ends up with a probabilistic estimate of the amount of undiscovered resources. In cases where we've done this in the past, it turns out to be fairly robust and match fairly closely what is then later discovered. But obviously, when you're talking about things that are undiscovered, they are in fact undiscovered. So it is an estimate. It's not an actual inventory of what is there.
Thank you, Larry. Next question, which I think is very interesting. Where and how does the information on upstream use of selected minerals come from for USGS commodity summaries and reports? The asker notes that many manufacturers in the electronic industry, where a lot of these metals and minerals are used, are hesitant to release that information to outsiders.
Yeah, we collect information. This is Steve Fortier. We collect information from a variety of sources, and for our domestic reporting, we canvass directly mining and mineral processing facilities throughout the U.S. and collect that information from them directly. We also collect information globally in a somewhat different process that also includes questionnaire forms that we send out to cooperators in other countries, but we rely on a lot of other sources of information from other countries, including folks on the ground there in industry and in U.S. embassies and other sources, as well as company reports and other sources of information. So there is a wide variety of information sources that we access and that our specialists have to review and consolidate and validate in some way to get reliable estimates. This is it's a fundamental part of what we do. But the principal avenues are direct canvassing for domestic and questionnaires to government agencies in other countries, supplemented by other forms of information.
Thank you, Steve. Next question, how are geopolitical factors put into the risk component of critical minerals? For example, with so many critical minerals dependent on supply from China, how is the risk of conflict with China addressed in that risk component?
For the OSTP NSTC report that we just issued, the World Governance Indicators are in the supply, the concentration of supply factor as a multiplicative multiplier of the country concentration to capture the governance risk as quantified by the World Governance Indicators. So we take that information directly for all of the countries that are covered by the World Bank, which is basically everybody, and use it in a formula that addresses country concentration weighted by the governance index for the countries where the supply is concentrated. I'm not sure if that was clear, but that's how we do it.
Thank you. We're going to go ahead and take one last question, and I think it wraps up this whole discussion pretty well. What are the fundamental earth science questions and answers that would be most valuable for helping with the critical minerals challenge?
I think that could probably be answered on several levels. This is Larry Meinert from the Mineral Resources Program. One of them is basic research to understand the geology and occurrence of each of the minerals that might be identified as critical both now and somewhere in the future. Steve Fortier has described the metric that we have developed to identify which elements are most likely to be of concern somewhere in the future. And part of our challenge is to do the research and understanding the geologic occurrences of those elements once they're identified as something to be concerned about. That research, of course, takes a fair bit of time, and it's not possible to do research on the entire periodic table at once. You have to prioritize, and so that's where we try to work closely, and we anticipate working even more closely in the future with this ongoing risk assessment. But the basic geologic research that needs to be done is fundamental, and it's something that we rely upon adequate funding from Congress, the support of the state geologists and other stakeholders to make sure that we can do that fundamental basic research to answer these applied questions that will undoubtedly continue to come up in the future.
Thank you, Larry. Rod or Steve, would you like to address that question as well?
Well, and from my perspective, I would just reemphasize the importance of our ongoing ability to collect reliable information. Really can't address issues of emerging risk without understanding where materials are being produced and whether we are able to get them, which requires a robust, in our view, a robust federal government involvement in acquiring this information and continuing to do that. The demands for all of the materials that we're now using in increasingly larger quantities is probably only going to get is only going to increase in the future, which makes it essential to ensure that we can continue to understand where we were able to get these materials and whether there are risks in continuing supply.
This is Rod. I don't have anything to add. I'm quite happy with Larry and Steve's answers.
Thank you very much, Larry, Steve, and Rod, for speaking today. That's all of our questions for today's webinar. If you have any questions that were not answered today, you can email them to us at cipinfo@americangeosciences.org, and we'll make sure to send your questions along to the speakers. This concludes our webinar for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.